I see blockchain tech getting to that point within the next 5 is probably optimistic, let's say 10 years. And there's a lot of applications, a lot of utility of blockchain tech that transcends just a means of payment. And one example that I often like to utilize because it's fresh on people's minds in the United States is voting. There are ways that blockchain technology could be utilized to really solve all of these issues that we've been facing for quite a long time. And people need to understand that this is not just you're buying a stock that's going to make you money. It's not a stock. You're not just looking at some alternative investment vehicle or means of commerce. The actual utility for this tech really needs to be something that people appreciate.
Kind of introduce yourself real quickly for our audience?
Sure. So I'm Rich Sanders. I'm the lead investigator with CipherBlade. CipherBlade is a blockchain analysis company. We're most well known for scam and hack investigations. We also do security and solvency audits for cryptocurrency exchanges, diligence for VCs, and provide services to law firms.
So that's all confusing to me. Okay, Jesse, take it away.
So cryptocurrencies are not supposed to be trackable. So when these things get hacked, how do you're interested in the blockchain, but how do you follow where they might have gone?
So that's a very good question because it's a common misconception that cryptocurrencies are not traceable. In fact, they are typically very traceable. The majority of the most well-known cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin and Ethereum, are very traceable. In fact, anybody can go to a website known as a block explorer. You could go to, for example, blockchair.com for Bitcoin, or Etherscan for Ethereum. And you could paste in a wallet address and see the entire history of that wallet address. It's obviously much more complicated than that to do what I do, but ultimately the misconception, which is kind of amusing, right? That it's 2021, and this is a misconception that's almost a decade old at this point, or older, but I say almost a decade old because within that 2014 era, there was a lot of dark web markets that was kind of the spike from there on, right? There's still folks that think on both sides cryptocurrency is not traceable. So you still see a lot of drug dealers getting busted on that premise.
Right. Now, is it because now we hear that a lot about cryptocurrencies, and then we also hear about that the blockchain is a registry. And so everything is supposed to be written on the registry, but which is it? And how do we think about it?
That's another a great question. So blockchain technology in and of itself, I mean, a common descriptor is distributed ledger technology, right? So that's effectively when you're looking at this, whether it's in a block explorer or one of the more sophisticated tools a company like mine would use, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at that ledger that is the entire history of the transactions and what each wallet address has done.
So that is the beginning of how you think about tracing if something's gone?
Generally, yes. So typically, if somebody comes to us with a theft situation, scam or hack, they're going to have, here's the transaction or here are the transactions that were associated with this incident. And that's our launchpad.
Everybody talks about these in these very sophisticated ways. But is it that, or is it like people posting their password someplace they shouldn't? Is the problem with it from a technological standpoint the human factor? Is that the part that gets exploited?
Absolutely, and that is a phenomenal question because I can't emphasize this enough. Law enforcement is incredibly overwhelmed with these requests. Companies like mine are incredibly overwhelmed with these requests. We've had to bump up our rates. We have a minimum case that will take that anything less than $100,000 we can't help out with. It is incredibly important that people getting into cryptocurrencies understand these transactions are irreversible. This isn't like dealing with credit cards where there's a chargeback. Those centralized protections are gone. And there's a common phrase in the industry called be your own bank. And it's not just a meme. It is something that people have to understand if they're getting into this tech. The human error thing is what it boils down to every time. Focusing on hacks, effectively every hack of, let's say, a self-hosted wallet, like not a cryptocurrency exchange account, boils down to the fact when you set up a cryptocurrency wallet, whether it's on your phone or on your computer, during the setup instructions, you're typically going to be provided a seed phrase or a recovery phrase, sometimes it's called. And the instructions will say, write this down. Don't take a screenshot. don't store it online. And sure enough, what ends up happening, people end up not following those instructions and they lose their life savings.
So in your mind, is it for the people who are just coming in, is it the safest thing to, if they were going to get into cryptocurrency, to, set up a Coinbase account and then do a Bitcoin, vault, so that they have to authenticate it? It has to be authenticated by 2 email addresses and takes a week or something?
As a rule, I recommend that people self-custody their cryptocurrencies, meaning that they don't rely on an exchange or any third party, that you should be the key holder to your cryptocurrency. And
writing it down, right? That's in the end.
Exactly.
You just don't.
You have to chisel it in stone in your house.
You have to write it down. Then you have to remember where you put it, because I've done this now. And I can't remember where I put my password. So then I asked somebody on
really
here with me, and then she sent it to me in a text, and that means that, of course, it's everyone on the internet has it. So
you don't have a lot of money in there, do you?
I have no money. No, I'm not on that, but just in general,
right.
I have a question before, though, because I got a little lost for a minute. The system of which you go after the hacker scammer, though, don't you then have to break into the system to do that? So is some of the technique, is that sort of, how do you follow the scammer? I mean, you don't have to give us all your trade secrets, but I think I find that really interesting. Like, how do you solve a crime?
So there's a number of different ways, of course. I would say hacking into hackers is very abnormal. That's typically not what you're looking at. Typically what you're looking at, whether you're looking at a hack or a scam, is you're tracing the cryptocurrency to a cash out point, right? So for example, if you scammed me and I wanted to investigate that, I would be following the blockchain. You sent it to this wallet, then to this wallet, and then I have to make a determination, which is why you need a tool like the one my company most utilizes, which is Chainalysis, to know what is each wallet. So for example, you might be following this on a block explorer and see this address has a whole bunch of activity, right? We have people that email us on a daily basis. Oh, well, this person that scammed me is this billionaire, obviously, based upon this wallet. It's like, no, dude, that's a Coinbase address or a Binance address or whatever. From there, once it's traced to that exchange, what ends up happening is a subpoena is put in, and typically that's done with law enforcement. Some people come to us where they have already retained legal counsel, so they'll be able to put that subpoena in. We get that subpoena return and we review it, and that could be other cryptocurrency withdrawals. We continue the investigation that way. Could be withdrawals to a bank account. Sometimes it's going to have an identity document, and there you go, you've got your person.
Does law enforcement have a chance? If I steal some Bitcoin from someplace and then I, in 20 minutes, move it to England, to Germany, to Greece, to down to South Africa, and then back over here somewhere, and each one is a different subpoena. Does law enforcement have a chance to follow all those transactions and find out what happened to my money?
So this ties into what I was talking about earlier about how law enforcement's incredibly overwhelmed with this right now, as are companies like mine. As a rule of thumb, if it's anything less than a $100,000 loss, it's pretty unlikely that law enforcement or a company like mine is going to be able to help, because there are expenses associated, right? I mean, investigators have to be paid for their time. Attorneys have to be paid for their time. As far as it going to different locations in the world, typically that doesn't matter. It's obviously a little bit more difficult to get, for example, a Russian or a Chinese exchange to cooperate with some of these things, but it could go through, I mean, we've done tracing where it goes through hundreds of wallets or dozens of exchanges. They do what's called chain hopping, which is they go from one exchange to another, switch out the cryptocurrency. All that does is add time to it, but hypothetically, if you're talking about a whole boatload of money, they can float it through as many places as they want. It's just a matter of resources to investigate.
Now, if I, send Bitcoin and then I change it into Ethereum and then I change it into Dogecoin and then I change it into whatever, does it matter? Does that make it harder to investigate?
So for Bitcoin and Ethereum, it doesn't make it substantially harder. It really depends what they're doing with it. So with Bitcoin and Ethereum, there are things that are called mixers, which is essentially you deposit funds there, you give it a wallet address, and then it's going to obfuscate the financial trail. Mixers are not a fail-safe. There are ways to, for an analyst such as myself, to attempt to defeat a mixer, but it's very resource intensive. Some cryptocurrencies, ones like Dogecoin, for example, they're not widely accepted or not accepted, they're not widely supported within analysis tools. But that doesn't mean it's not traceable. It's just, it's more difficult to do so because there's not going to be as much information about this wallet address is Binance or this is Bittrex and so on.
So so let's say that, somebody, how do your clients find you? And do they come and sit down and say, I got a story to tell you, Richard, about something terrible that happened? And
tell us, like, they don't out anyone, like, or give us a scenario of, somebody coming to you and here's the.
Yeah, they come in the middle of the night, there's a knock on the door, it's raining outside, and you guys sit down in a conference room and how
Well,
does it work?
thankfully, I haven't had anybody show up to my residence yet, although I will never rule that out for the future.
We're not
Yeah.
going to tell anyone where you live. Don't worry.
Yeah, well, we don't
That's
know.
actually not hard to find, and that's by design. I'm actually, so it's another interesting thing about my company. Most of my team is under a pseudonym because of the
Right.
nature of the work we do. I'm actually very public facing. My address is public. So
Right.
yeah, thankfully nobody yet has been knocking on my door begging for help. I wouldn't rule that out at the rate things are going. Typically, the way people find us is either through word of mouth, or they're searching for how do I get my Bitcoin back, and they come across my company. And that's because there's not a lot of companies doing this type of work. In fact, the majority of recovery companies that are advertised are actually scams themselves, which is almost like it just really goes to show how brutal these scammers can be. So typically the way that'll look is we get an email and they describe the situation. And the number one thing that we need to know, regardless of whether it's a hack or a scam, getting that couple of paragraphs of what happened is good, but we need the transaction IDs in order to do a preliminary analysis. And that is the one thing that we're always asking these folks for. They get us that transaction information. We do a preliminary analysis. We say, we think it's going to take roughly this many hours. Here's a retainer estimate. If they elect to push forward with us, we continue our analysis. We work a report. And really our value proposition, and this is from somebody in law enforcement, I think that he summarized it in a very great way, which is we write a report. We basically give the case to law enforcement on a silver platter. We've done everything that they would be doing, shy of the stuff that we can't do because we're not law enforcement.
Now, do you have to verify that that person coming to you with the problem is the person that they say they are?
So we do need to verify that they are who they say they are, which is important because we can't file a law enforcement report without giving them accurate information about the affected party. It's also important that not only they verify who they are, but they need to verify the funds are theirs too, right? Meaning, like, anybody could say that's my wallet address, but there's a way to prove that. And that's actually by design within these cryptocurrencies as well. You could do things what's called a signed message to prove that you have ownership of a wallet address.
Are there black hats and white hats? When we hear that term, does that describe you're a group of people who are committed to good things, and there's people out there that you see as committed to bad things?
I think that's an accurate description. I mean, you've definitely got a bit of a dichotomy from your traditional cyber, your black hats and white hats there. It's a lot more distinct in the crypto space. But you definitely have your known black hats, right? Like Lazarus out of North Korea. They are absolutely brutal when it comes to targeting for cryptocurrency. As far as white hats, there's unfortunately not quite enough, which is a shame, especially if you look at Ethereum and all the DeFi hacks. There's obviously a ton of black hats out there focusing on that. Not quite enough white hats focusing on prevention or, let alone the investigative part of it.
What are some, like, I'm just intrigued, like, who, like, regular person, average person is using this, to hide something? I think you talked about earlier to some of the team, like divorce cases or something, and can you give us a scenario? I mean, it just sounds incredible. This is a new way to be deceptive, right? So what is some kind of scenario around that?
I'm thrilled you mentioned divorce cases because that ties perfectly into one of the things we discussed earlier, which is that misconception about, oh, well, Bitcoin's not traceable, so I'll be fine. I've been on, at this point, more divorce cases than I want to disclose, where the tracing for these divorce cases has historically always been simple. And it's because of the fact, and guys, I'm sorry, I have to say it, it's always guys. It's never been a woman. It's always these husbands or soon to be ex-husbands that think they're slick. They withdraw all the cryptocurrency from the exchange account. They put it into their self-hosted wallets, and then they just say, oh, look, here's my exchange account with nothing in it. And then it's a matter of tracing, usually within 2 or 3 wallets, and I can find out what's going on.
Right.
Oh, well, you just told all the guys not to do that. Just FYI.
Well, they shouldn't do that because it's the wrong thing to do.
Right. No, that's incredible.
You know, do you, like you say, Lazarus in North Korea, you know, do you get to know the people on the other side? Do you see the same person twice, or is there so much in this space that you'll never see the same person again?
You're speaking specifically about like the criminals, right?
Adversaries. That, I mean, do you see the adversary as a person in your mind? Do you see, you know, how do you see the tapestry of traces? Is it nameless, or is this, you're thinking, wow, there's this asshole over there that's trying to do something, I'm gonna stop them? You know, how do you think about that?
So it really depends upon the case. If it's a case that involves, you know, for example, a North Korean hacking group, then the odds of ever, knowing who that person is by name or seeing them are obviously slim to none. You have your other end of the spectrum, which is, for example, SIM swappers, right? And for those that don't know, SIM swapping is when either there's an insider at a telephone company, or they call the telephone company pretending to be you in order to get your phone number ported to a phone they control. And then they utilize that in order to reset your accounts, which is another very important tip for folks that are new to cryptocurrency. Please take the 2 minutes to download Google Authenticator and scan a QR code and protect your accounts. It will protect your life savings. It takes about 2 minutes. It's not that hard to do.
Yeah.
But for those types of hacks,
and all that does, what an authenticator does is just gives you a number so that it actually goes to your phone and it can't be cloned to some other phone, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
And in simpler terms, yes. But for those types of investigations, I mean, there's been tons of press releases about arrests related to those. And those are always amusing because these are, they're most often kids, 18 to barely adults, 18 to 25-year-old males that are into video gaming or whatever the case might be, calling themselves undoxable gods. And then a few months later, looking at them in the courtroom. So
Right. But those are the sort of, people who sort of come up with a very simple thing. And it seems like the phone company should have a way of shutting those ones down now. I mean, are we getting better at being able to do that?
So I would disagree on phone companies being the ones responsible to shut that down, because you have to think of it from, first of all, the business lens of the telco. The majority of their customer base are not people dealing with cryptocurrency. The majority of their customer base are people that they don't want to spend extra money, so that way all of these employees have to go through this advanced and sophisticated training. And perhaps even more simply, the majority of SIM swap requests are legitimate, of course, and people don't want to have to go through all of these hurdles. I want to, go to a store and give them a blood sample and a photo ID. That's not what most customers want to do. The other thing that I'll flag is that it gets into the overall theme of this is be your own bank, not your keys, not your coins. And when there's a solution, which is quite literally take out the phone, app store, authenticator, scan a QR code, done in 3 minutes. Security is an individual responsibility. It can't be outsourced to, hypothetically, it can be outsourced if you're a high net worth individual and you want to do a custody solution. But for Joe and Jane retail, as I like to call them, you are your own security. Download Google Authenticator, write down that seed phrase, and you'll be fine.
Or Microsoft Authenticator, any number of authenticators, yeah.
Or Authy, or any of them will do.
Yeah. So that's a hack where you have somebody calling up the phone company and saying, well, I need to clone my phone. What are the really sophisticated ones where you've gone, wow, I'm really surprised by that, or that's a inspired, terrible thing I never thought of?
I hate to say this, but very few hacks I can describe that way.
Really?
I might describe some of the DeFi like smart contract exploits that way, but the overwhelming majority, and I mean truly overwhelming majority of hacks, are really, really simple failures of key management, not writing down a seed phrase. And this, of course, applies to the absolute overwhelming majority of what are called retail hacks, Joe and John Dane hacks. But this even applies to exchanges, right? A lot of these big ticket cryptocurrency exchange hacks were actually not sophisticated, and I'm limited in what I could talk to you about that, but it comes down to that same principle of key management.
A smart contract, would you just describe what a smart contract is?
I'm going to try to think of this in a way that's more layman's terms than technical. Effectively, a smart contract, what it does is it's a thing on a blockchain, most common in the Ethereum blockchain, where it serves a given function. So for example, you could set up a smart contract to, in the event of an outcome for something, you can set up a smart contract where if this person or that person wins an election, a person will, receive this cryptocurrency or not. You could set it up for, the term contract, right? You could have this set up for agreements with other folks, and that's a complete oversimplification of it. But these smart contracts are often used for lending platforms or for staking or a variety, because most folks into cryptocurrency are in it for financial reasons of financial applications.
You mentioned voting. I have a question. Do you ever get called into let's say somebody, is paying a candidate or they're doing something nefarious using the blockchain, and then you get called in to understand, if there was a tipping? Do you get into these really intense political cases ever?
I'll say that I'm very limited in what I could say, but you're not wrong that would be something hypothetically someone would do.
I understand, which is
So how do you interrupt a smart contract? Because it seems like it's written in the blockchain, it's transparent. So how does somebody hack a smart contract?
It's a great question too. And another common phrase in the industry is code is law. So a smart contract is only as good as it's coded, meaning that there could be functions within the smart contract that could be exploited. There could be, basically, if you tell a smart contract to do something and it's within the parameters, it will do that, which is why, the oversimplification of smart contracts I gave earlier was for purposes of understanding what smart contracts are. That's not to say that coding a smart contract is necessarily easy, because there's a lot of vulnerabilities that have to be considered.
As you look out into the future, where you're going to have so many different kinds of things become NFTs, you're going to have them become how do you see that our move towards an evolution of these tools? Maybe you could say we're at minute one of cryptocurrencies, and we're probably at second one of NFTs. How do you see the future, and what should we be thinking about?
The way, first I want to emphasize what a great question that is, because of the fact that the majority of the people in the space, like I've said a couple of times, and I really want to drive this point home, are speculative investors, and they don't even understand this tech. This tech is amazing, and I like to compare it to some historical examples, meaning like right now, you can take out your phone. I could look on Instagram and I could see, oh, this person had that for lunch. And if you flash back to 80s, 90s, once upon a time, you had to understand what an IP address is. You had to understand what a JPEG is. Now it just works. People don't even know that they're accessing the internet on their phones or what any of these files are. I see blockchain tech getting to that point within the next 5 is probably optimistic, let's say 10 years. And there's a lot of applications, a lot of utility of blockchain tech that transcends just a means of payment. And one example that I often like to utilize, because it's fresh on people's minds in the United States, is voting. There are ways that blockchain technology could be utilized to really solve all of these issues that we've been facing for quite a long time. And people need to understand that this is not just you're buying a stock that's going to make you money. It's not a stock. You're not just looking at some alternative investment vehicle or means of commerce. The actual utility for this tech really needs to be something that people appreciate.
I'm a person who doesn't really understand it, Richard. I'm sorry to tell you this. Jesse's tried to explain it to me. What is the tech? What is the blockchain? What is it?
So it's distributed ledger technology. And if you think of it within the context of, if you understand it within the context of a means of payment, which you seem to have a grasp on, you can utilize that same understanding to understand the decentralized nature and why that could be beneficial. So great example is, we talked about how Bitcoin's not private either, right? There's that transparency. So when you combine all of these factors, there are ways to implement this into other solutions. Voting being a great example, which is not one person would be in charge of this system, or there's not a centralized point of failure. It is what it is. You have, your public-private key pair, which I think that If you understand Bitcoin, you understand those terminologies, and you would utilize that private key in order to vote in an election, right? Nobody can alter your vote. Nobody can forge your vote. There's a lot of promise, and I use the voting example, but there's so many other ones. Healthcare is a great one too.
What's the application in healthcare?
So you could think of it from the lens of insurance, right? How much overhead is associated with insurance premiums based upon, for example, you need to have people that review these things, how much fraud goes on, right? And those are all things based upon the transparency and immutable nature of blockchain tech that could be muted.
Do we have, sorry, Jesse, I just have one last question. Are we getting it in an equitable way? Like, do you have to be kind of cool or rich, or, can anyone access the blockchain? So how do we democratize or make it so that it is really fair for everyone to access?
That's a great question too.
I'm not sure it's actually important that it be fair for everybody. I mean, it's not really that. It is fair in that anybody can use it.
Well, but okay, but people don't know about it, but you were going to answer that question, so.
Yeah, I think under the context of like a voting blockchain, for example, it's not the kind of thing where like somebody would invest in it. It would be hypothetically by design, you're getting issued a public-private key pair and it serves a function. So there wouldn't be like a significant transfer of value, if any at all. And I think the same thing would apply for a healthcare blockchain, or specifically if you're looking at like a healthcare insurance blockchain. If you're looking at this from the lens of cryptocurrencies themselves, that answer is different, but that kind of gets into the folks that are obviously invested earlier. If you believe in the tech, they're probably going to do better long term.
When I think of the technology, I think of its ability to empower community more than anything else. If we forget it as a currency, it seems like you can make the world smaller because people who have aligned interests can find each other easier. They can collect together in groups of community. How do you see it?
As far as fostering like innovation in smaller communities, or?
Well, as in that anybody can be collected in different groups. If I have an interest, I can find other people who have the same interest, and we can collaborate together. And somehow the applications have to be guided towards empowering human lives in some way. Otherwise, the purpose of technology would just be to create a dark web as opposed to making something that's positive. But how do you see it?
So I'm going to answer this in a less technical way. I'm going to focus a little bit less on the blockchain and more about broadly how the tech sector has kind of disrupted the world, but specifically how I think blockchain companies are going to disrupt the world. Right now, there's a notable disparity. If you're with a company and you want to hire somebody with hypothetically the exact same skill sets, the exact same background, which is, of course, that's a hypothetical, and they're located in one part of the world or another, because you could hire somebody that's incredibly well qualified somewhere, let's say in like the Far East, and they would be expecting less than somebody in the West. Whereas I think that, and I think COVID's a factor in this too, with the whole working remotely thing. I think blockchain tech, just as a broad theme with the tech industry, kind of as a precursor, is going to make that more fair. I think that getting back to blockchain tech itself, it enables that, again, that transparency and that fairness, meaning there could be rules, and the smart contract is a good example for this. If you achieve this, then you get that. If you do this, then you get that. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world or who you are. You put in work, you get rewarded. And I think that's one of potentially dozens examples that one could go over that would bridge that gap and make things more fair.
When you look down the road, what kind of problems do you see that we're not dealing with now? Like, you're going to be around a long time doing this work that you're doing, but where do you see it going that it isn't yet, but becomes problems later?
I could tell you a problem now that's going to be a massive problem later. And I hate to sound repetitive, but I'm really just trying to avoid a very painful situation for the general public. There are multiple endless emails we get per day with that I got scammed or hacked, and it always boils down to either trusting someone they shouldn't have or not doing that key management. And this tech is really promising, but I don't think that it's going to be possible based upon how blockchain tech is just upon fundamentals to have a key management responsibility be delegated, meaning that there needs to be a worldwide cultural change where people need to understand the importance of please just follow these instructions. And these companies, they really emphasize it. I mean, yeah, you buy any of these hardware wallets these days, they include a booklet and they're very specific. Write this down. You set up, MetaMask or MyEther wallet or any of the common Ethereum wallets that they have in big letters and in red, please write this down. There needs to be a worldwide understanding of following these instructions, that they're not just put there for the health of the developers of these wallets. Once we get over that bridge, I think that we have a lot of potential here, but I see that being the biggest issue for sure.
That's a human problem.
Yeah.
And like if it was in the internet, you have a well-funded nonprofit called the Mozilla Foundation that is tasked with some of these things. We have the Bitcoin Foundation, but I'm not sure it's focused as much on these issues. Does anybody own this besides the manufacturers themselves? Is there any advocate in the center of all this?
It's hard to get a advocate within the context of getting people to, and I know this might sound a little bit crass, but it's hard to get an advocacy group going for following instructions to set up a wallet. I know that sounds really cold. I do think that public education is important on this stuff. There are companies that are putting out good information on this, and not just CipherBlade, but there's companies like MyCrypto that have a really good blog about security practices. Some of the exchanges are putting in good efforts there too. The Coinbase blog, that's a really good resource for security. But there's only so much that could be said before it gets repetitive. And typically when you're looking at such advocacy groups, you're looking at things like potentially regulation and that sort of thing. I don't think regulating this is the answer, because that's going to stifle innovation. I think that effectuating a public change insofar as that accountability is what's needed.
I think what you're talking about though is, Richard, you go on CNN or Fox News or whatever, and you tell a story that we all relate to. I mean, I think it's just the everyday person. As you're talking, I'm thinking I got to get to my son right away to make sure he's dealt with his Ethereum account, whatever. It's like, it's the everyday connection to what you're talking about. So it doesn't feel like it belongs to everybody else, but you tell a story of a person whose entire savings was wiped out, or the person that was the divorce, or whatever. I think it's really, in the end, you got to go, people's got to go, oh shit, like that's scary. And those are, I think, the scenarios, Jesse, that it's the storytelling around it. In the end, that doesn't feel like you're reading, you're reading a whole whatever that nobody ever reads, the legalese, if you will.
Well, that's a really important point, because if there's a common joke among folks that are within this industry where when you start hearing about Bitcoin, or especially other cryptocurrencies, altcoins on CNN, it's a pretty good possibility that you're at the top of a market cycle. But I flag that because how many times do you hear on major media outlets about the price of cryptocurrency relative to hearing about somebody losing their life savings? That alone, is probably a multiplier. And then in the minority of times where you're hearing those stories, which should serve as a wake-up call, how often are these media outlets sharing information about here's how to prevent this, right? And that is the massive disconnect. I would say, if anything, press has a responsibility when they're putting this information out there. Oh, Ethereum just broke $3,000. If you want to get into this, then here's what you should research first. That's what I would see as an effective change.
Ethereum, how many other blockchains are there besides Ethereum, and why is Ethereum the best one?
So I like Ethereum. I'm not sure if I'm going to say any particular blockchain is the best one. I'm a fan of a lot of different cryptocurrencies. In fact, ironically, at least according to some folks, ironically, I'm a huge fan of Monero, which is actually a privacy cryptocurrency. And the point of a privacy cryptocurrency would be to prevent somebody, such as myself, from tracing it. I think that different cryptocurrencies, different blockchains have different uses. So it's hard to say which is the best one. Ethereum has seen a massive spike in exchange rate over the past few weeks. Is that legitimate adoption, or is that speculation? I mean, the reality of this industry is that everything's speculation, to include Bitcoin. There are definitely some promises insofar as innovation from the Ethereum team, that they have some very interesting stuff that had been launched recently and is about to be launched. A lot of it boils down to adoption. How many actual, current or future real world applications are living on that blockchain? For Ethereum right now, the presence of DeFi is definitely why it's getting a lot of attention.
And what is DeFi?
DeFi is decentralized finance. So that's a lot of the staking and lending type of applications I was talking about earlier. Another reason why that's so popular is what's called a decentralized exchange. And a very well-known example of that is Uniswap, where with a decentralized exchange, you're not relying on a central entity, which gets into that trustless thing, which is a very important concept within this technology. Why should you need to rely on a centralized exchange when you can utilize a smart contract to conduct your exchange? You're not relying on an exchange that could fail, get hacked. Of course, the smart contract could get hacked, but that's a whole other set of issues. You don't have to worry about solvency. If the funds are there and it can execute the trade, that's in the smart contract, it's going to happen. If there's not enough there to execute the trade, you're not going to be able to get the trade done, which is great. It's a great innovation.
How would you regulate an industry like this? Because it isn't anywhere and it's everywhere.
So I'm going to say this as somebody that has multiple conversations per day with you name a government agency, I've spoken to them. It's tough to regulate. And I think that as a rule, we shouldn't be thinking about how to regulate it. We should be thinking about responsiveness. And I can't emphasize this enough, because not only does regulation stifle innovation, but this stuff moves so fast that even if I was sitting here and telling you, yes, let's regulate, by the time such regulations are effectuated, it's irrelevant. And so the real answer is, how do we adapt, right? And I'm not saying this as like some type of crypto libertarian, let alone like crypto anarchist, but the reality is this tech is here and we have to adapt to it. There could be some regulations that, yeah, I'm not entirely opposed to, but yeah, there's been, for example, discussions about regulating what was referred to as self-hosted wallets. That is just simply not going to happen. That would absolutely fall flat on its face. It would make a mockery of government.
How do you see the rise of NFTs and the ability to put everything on the blockchain? Every kind of transaction, every kind of, I can be an investor in that share over there. I can be an investor in, in anything.
So I'll start with NFTs. I think that the significant rise of NFTs that we've seen over the past year is really a lot of that speculative investment that I was talking about. And the reason I want to flag that is that that's not too far removed from, like, for example, what's happened with Dogecoin. And I have concerns about it insofar as, if somebody is brand new to all this stuff, they hear about it on CNN. They think that they're going to get rich quick because they heard about it on CNN, and every influencer on TikTok and you name it is saying, yes, buy NFTs or buy Doge. I'm not saying it's a zero-sum game, but inevitably there's going to be more people that get burned than people that make a profit.
Isn't Doge on the way down now anyways?
I haven't checked. So that's another thing. I very rarely check cryptocurrency prices, but that's because I'm very gainfully employed in the industry, and
Work on the other side of these things. So yeah, I would hope you're not checking it. You're right. You wouldn't be checking it.
Yeah, I mean, like, the reason, yeah, I share that because it's almost kind of a meme within the industry too, where you've got your speculative investors where they're hovering over coin market cap or coin gecko and checking the exchange rate every 3 seconds. And somebody like me, I might check in once a week if it's relevant. I think Dogecoin, what did it hit? Like 30 cents, 40 cents, something like that?
Something like that. I think it might even be higher, but I think it's, my understanding is it's going the other way now,
And that doesn't shock me. It also wouldn't, I would not look at you surprised if you told me Dogecoin went to 75%. Again, this is a very, very speculative market. You've got something that has a fraction of the liquidity of Bitcoin. You have much higher volatility based upon that. But the reason I flag that as a concern is that there are folks where, again, they heard about it on CNN or TikTok and they're getting into it for the first time. And they're putting in way more than they can afford to lose, and they're going to get burned. And that concerns me. Kind of the same thing with NFTs. I am concerned about people getting burned that way because they're going to be shut off to the industry and they're not going to open their eyes to the other part of what you were just describing, which is this tech is awesome. It could be utilized as a more transparent way, for example, to deal with stocks. I don't want them to be shut off to that opportunity in the future.
And where do you see Decentraland, in buying, property, which is also speculative, but what are your feelings about that? And have you seen crimes happening in those environments?
So I think that, on the topic of property or real estate, or I mean, there's blockchain solutions that are out there for bullion, for example, where Pax Gold, where you can own quite literally digital gold. I think that these are all great innovations, but again, it boils down to people have to understand it. If you don't want to take the time to understand, this is why you have to write down your seed phrase, then probably buying physical gold is better for you than owning
Right.
digital gold. If you want to take that time to understand that, then you get the benefit of being able to own that digital gold, which is, you can liquidate that a whole lot more quickly, or you could have the option of getting into, you were talking about property or real estate solutions for that. You've got your benefits.
Digital property and digital solutions. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want our audience to think that we were talking about actual land.
Which I was, by the way.
So, in some sense, we're working towards some idea of the simulation in some part. When you look down the road 10 or 20 years, how do you see people interacting with this other, digital world? Am I going to have a digital house, and in my digital house have digital paintings and an avatar of myself and a boat in the yard and a lake to go and ride on? How do you see these things coming together or not?
That's a tough question, and I'll even say that as a person that's often described as creative, that's a very tough one. And I'll say that because, to be quite candid, I didn't expect to live till 20, let alone 30. But that's a whole other set of issues associated. I think that this industry moves so fast and so unpredictably that it's really hard to pinpoint what that future could look like. And I think that it's fair to say that within our lifetimes that we're going to be utilizing blockchain solutions, for example, on our phone without thinking about it. I think that the future you're talking about sounds awesome, and I would love to be a part of it, but it might be a little bit ambitious because we have some hurdles to get over first.
Okay.
I don't want to be the fun police, but I often have to be the fun police within my own industry.
I imagine it's your job, or you're actually the pick up the pieces police.
Unfortunately.
I want to ask you one last question though. You said, oh, it's been a heck of a week. You said it's a tough week. I don't know what's tough. Is there something specific?
What's tough is exactly what was just described about people coming to us to pick up the pieces. I can tell you here is when you will know this industry has matured. When my company has more people coming to us before the fact instead of after the fact, meaning more people saying, I want to contact your company to do proactive security, or a VC coming to us and saying, please do due diligence on this project, or I'm interested in getting into this, but I want to make sure that this project, is fair. Can you look at this? That'll be the day this industry matures. But unfortunately, and this is not the first time it's happened, whenever there's a spike in the market, exactly all the things we were talking about, people hear about it on CNN and they get into it way too quickly without understanding it, and they lose a ton of money. Looking at my email inbox, since the time we've been on this call, I think we've gotten 8 unreads, and I would wager easily 6 of those are exactly that pick up the pieces situation.
Do you have a lot of people coming to you before the problem happens?
Not enough. Not enough at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
We know
It's probably, if I had to give you an estimate, like out of every 500 scammer hack inquiries that we get, we might get one that is early bird. I want to work on security, or can you do diligence on this?
That's
Interesting.
Wow.
Well, Richard, thank you for
thank
you for sharing all this with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for getting this information out there. People need to know this.
Yeah, I guess write it down, right? Write it down.
It is in the instructions. Well, chisel, it's a great example too. There are there's things you could buy out there for like $70-$80 where it's called a crypto steel, where you can actually get it onto steel on something that's fireproof, waterproof. So I mean, like the common excuses are, not that I'm being lazy, but I can't trust this piece of paper because of a fire. Think outside the box. Another common phrase, DYOR, do your own research. The tools and the solutions are out there, but if people can get over that hurdle, this is some really promising stuff.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, thank you very much.